Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell is brushing off concerns about the state of American democracy. Speaking to reporters in his home state of Kentucky yesterday, the top Republican was asked to comment on a new poll from NBC News where voters ranked threats to democracy as the #1 issue facing the country. Here is McConnell's response.
We have a very solid democracy. Very little election fraud. There is some. I mean, we've had people in Kentucky go to jail for that. It happens occasionally. But our democracy is solid, and I don't think of the things that we need to worry about, I wouldn't be worried about that.
Throughout this primary season, the Democratic Party in several states has spent money on ads to boost the far right or more pro-Trump candidates running in the Republican primary. The idea behind that strategy was the more extreme opponent theoretically would be easier to defeat in the general election. Joining us now is national political correspondent for Politico, David Siders, whose recent piece is titled, "There's a Huge Divide Among Democrats Over How Hard to Campaign for Democracy." David, good morning. I want to read part of your piece. You write, one Sunday afternoon in November, several of President Jimmy Carter's former aides and advisors met on a Zoom for a private call. For 3 or 4 years, the Carter administration veterans had been meeting like this to keep in touch. But more recently, as Republicans went from initial brief discomfort with the January 6th attack to rallying behind former President Donald Trump's false assertions that the election was stolen, their conversations had begun to become more urgent, focusing on the state of American democracy. And the assessment was grim. Yet as members of the Carter Group discussed the prospect of democracy's collapse, there was another crisis that troubled them just as much. The fact that as a voting issue, so few Democrats seem to care. Even after the experience of 2020 and the riot at the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and even as Republicans in the midterms parrot Trump's falsehoods, democracy has polled relatively low on the electorate's list of concerns. The January 6 committee hearings were encouraging, but Democrats competing in elections this year have not been pressing the issue anywhere near as hard as other concerns. So obviously, David, when you look at some of the numbers, that NBC poll did show that 21% of Americans view the preservation of democracy as the #1 issue facing the country right now. It's not, if you follow the money, where Democrats are spending. It's not where they're driving their messages in a lot of these races.
That's right. I think talking to Democrats after that poll came out and clearly was newsworthy because it was something different. I think there's not yet a belief that that's gelled in a sufficient number of polls that they'll be putting money there based on that one poll. But for Democrats who care about this stuff, that poll is encouraging. And I guess I would liken it to early days of climate change, where you would see some polls that would show that climate change is a big motivating issue. But in the totality, of the polling universe that Democrats were looking at, it didn't rise to something that they were willing to spend money on, at least in the early days.
So, David, it may be in the abstract, the preservation of democracy isn't front and center, but especially given the January 6th committee hearings, which are ongoing, and the argument we've heard from the White House and we have heard from some Democrats that we've got to keep these people away from our democracy because look what they did to it on January 6th or attempted to do to it. Is that taking hold with voters, or is it just more about the economy and inflation and the issues that impact their lives?
No, I think the one area where Democrats have found some success or think they do have some success, and Republicans are worried about if you talk to them, is not so much an attack on related to election being overturned or democracy itself, but it's using that as part of a broader puzzle to paint Republicans as extremists. And you do see that. You see in some of this advertising the use of a Republican's position on Roe in certain races, on schools or on guns, and pulling those all together to say this is an extremist outside of the mainstream. So I do think that as a part of a broader attack, Democrats find it useful. But as a standalone, we just haven't seen evidence of that.
It's only August and the midterms aren't until November, but given that there are so few people whose minds are persuadable in this country, would you think that looking at polls that come out now is a pretty good guide to what will happen in the midterms?
I think it's early. They're the best guide we have right now, or maybe that's not even true. These special elections, including the one tonight in New York that we'll all be looking at, are pretty good guides too. no, a lot can change over 3 months. I mean, heck, think where we were 3 months ago and 3 months before that. I know we say it over and over, but things are very, very fluid. And I think that's one of the problems for Democrats who want to get voters excited about democracy, is that the electorate tends to have a very short appetite for what it gets excited about. And that's the same problem that people who care about climate change have trying to talk to voters too. These are relatively slow-moving disasters that they're trying to make people get interested in, and that's difficult.
And there are a lot of Republicans on the ballot who participated in the attempt to stage the coup around the 2020 election, and some of them doing quite well. National political correspondent for Politico, David Siders, thanks for being with us this morning. We appreciate it.